Ethan Walker pressed his palm flat against the cold dirt of his wife's grave and said goodbye for the second time in his life, once when the fever took her and once when the mountain almost took him. He had nothing left to come home to, he knew that. He had made his peace with it, somewhere between the snow line and the valley floor, somewhere between the man he used to be and whatever hollow thing was riding south now. He told himself the land was gone. The cattle were gone. Everything Margaret had ever loved about that place was gone. He was wrong. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and come along for every part of this journey, and drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1885 sat heavy over the Colorado Rockies, the kind of heat that made the high-altitude air shimmer and pushed the cattle into the shade of the ponderosa pines long before noon. Ethan Walker hadn't felt that heat in nearly 2 years. He'd felt cold instead, bone-deep, soul-deep cold, the kind that comes from sleeping on mountain rock when your horse is gone and your supplies are buried under a February avalanche, and every man who knew your name assumes your body won't be found until the spring thaw. He'd survived anyway, not because he wanted to. That was the truth he hadn't said out loud to a single living soul. He'd survived because surviving was what his body did, even when his mind had stopped asking it to. He'd found shelter. He'd found food. He'd crawled down out of those mountains when the snow broke half a man, maybe less, and he'd worked 2 seasons on a cattle drive out of New Mexico just to have enough money to make this last ride north. He wasn't riding home. He was riding to say goodbye. That was the only reason he could give himself for making this trip at all. The bank had sent notice to his nearest neighbor, old Hector Prine, 3 counties over, almost 8 months ago. The land was forfeit. The note was called. Ethan Walker, presumed dead, had left behind a tidy little problem for the Cattlemen's Trust out of Denver, and they'd solved it the only way banks knew how. So he told himself he was just coming to look at it one more time. The house where he was born, the pasture his father had fenced post by post, the creek that ran clear in July and dried to a trickle by September, the small plot of ground behind the barn where Margaret was buried beneath a wooden cross he'd cut himself. He wasn't expecting anything. He crested the last ridge, the one that gave a man his first clear view of the Walker homestead, after 3 miles of switchback trail, and he pulled up short on the reins so hard that old Cutter stumbled and tossed his head in complaint. Smoke. There was smoke coming from the chimney. Ethan sat very still in the saddle and looked at it. His hand moved toward his hip out of something older than thought, his fingers finding the grip of the Colt he'd worn for 15 years. He didn't draw it. He just rested his hand there, while his eyes moved slow and careful across everything below him. The fence line along the north pasture, the section that had been sagging badly before he left, 3 posts rotted through at the base, was standing straight. New posts. Someone had set new posts. The garden plot beside the house, the one Margaret had planted every April and that Ethan had let go to weeds in the year after she died, was green. Growing. He could see the dark rows from up here, neat and tended, and the cattle pen beside the barn held animals. Not many, maybe a dozen head, but they were there, moving slow in the summer heat, alive. Ethan Walker stared at his dead land and watched it breathe. He rode down slow. He kept his hand near the Colt, but he didn't push Cutter into anything faster than a walk, because whatever was happening down there, he didn't want to come in sideways and start something he wasn't ready for. His mind was running through possibilities and discarding them faster than he could name them. Squatters, homesteaders who'd moved in thinking the place was abandoned. Someone the bank had put on the property to work it until sale. He didn't know. He didn't know, and not knowing made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the feeling that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the picture in front of him. He was 50 yards out when the front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch. She was maybe early 30s, lean and sun-browned the way ranch women got, wearing a plain work dress and boots that had seen hard use. Her hair was dark and pulled back with no particular care, like she'd pinned it up at dawn and hadn't thought about it since. She moved to the edge of the porch and stopped, and Ethan saw her right hand drop to her side where an old Winchester rifle was leaning against the porch rail. She didn't raise it, but she put her hand on the stock. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice was steady, no shake in it. "And I don't know that horse, so before you come any closer, I'd appreciate knowing your business." Ethan stopped Cutter at 30 yards. He looked at the woman. He looked at the house behind her. His house, his father's house, the house he'd been born in on a February morning in 1847, and something moved in his chest that he didn't have a name for. "My business," he said, "is that this is my land." The woman's eyes changed. Not fear exactly. Something else. Something that moved through her face like a shadow crossing a field. "That isn't possible," she said. "Ma'am, I assure you it is. My name is Ethan Walker. My father was Thomas Walker. This property was deeded to me on his death in 1871, and I have the papers to prove it, or I did before I lost everything in an avalanche on the north face of Mount Emmons in February of last year." He paused. "Who are you, and what are you doing on my land?" She hadn't moved, hadn't taken her hand off the rifle stock. But the color had drained from her face in a way that was almost frightening to watch, like a candle guttering. "They said you were dead," she said. "They said wrong. Mr. Walker." She stopped, started again. "Ethan Walker went into the mountains in the fall of 1883 and never came back. The Cattlemen's Trust sent a man out in the spring of 1884. Everyone in Larimer County knows. Everyone in Larimer County was mistaken." He pulled back his jacket and showed her he wasn't making a move toward the Colt. "Now I'd like to know who you are and why you're standing on my porch." She took her hand off the rifle. That small gesture, fingers releasing the stock hand dropping to her side, told him more about her than anything else could have. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't surrendering either. She was making a choice. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "And I've been keeping your land alive for 14 months. He didn't get down from the horse right away. He wasn't sure he trusted his legs. He looked at the fence line again, the garden, the cattle pen. He looked at the barn and saw that the doors were hanging straight. He'd left one of them with a broken hinge dragging on the ground, and someone had fixed it. Someone had fixed all of it. "Why?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. It came out flat like a plank of wood dropped on a floor. Clara Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Come inside. I'll put coffee on. This isn't a short answer." He tied Cutter at the post outside the post that someone had reinforced with a new crossbar, he noticed, and he stepped up onto the porch and through the front door of his own house for the first time in nearly 2 years. It looked like a home. That was what hit him first before anything else. When he'd left in the fall of 1883, the house had looked like what it was. A place where a man lived alone and was doing a poor job of managing it. Dishes where they fell. Blankets in a pile. His father's chair in the corner with a rip in the seat leather that Ethan had been meaning to fix for 2 years and never did. Margaret's curtains still hanging in the windows, but faded dusty, the color going out of them. The curtains were clean now. The chair had been repaired, the leather stitched back neatly with what looked like harness thread. The floor had been swept and the walls had been scrubbed, and on the table sat a small jar with wildflowers in it. Blue columbines, yellow cinquefoil, the kind of thing that didn't happen in a house where only a man was living. Ethan stood in the doorway and looked at his dead wife's house looking alive again and felt something crack open in his chest that he'd been holding shut for 3 years. He didn't let it show. He sat down at the table and Clara Whitmore put the coffee on. She told him the facts first, and she told them straight without apology or embellishment, like a woman who had decided a long time ago that the world went better when people said what was true. The Cattlemen's Trust had sent a man named Bellows out to the property in April of 1884 after Ethan had been missing for nearly 5 months. Bellows had inspected the land, noted the outstanding loan, noted the absence of any living owner, and filed a notice of default with the county recorder. The property was to be auctioned in September of that year. "I came to Larimer County in March," Clara said. She was sitting across the table from him, both hands wrapped around her coffee cup. I'd been working in a boarding house down in Pueblo. Before that, a dry goods store in Santa Fe. I was looking for... She paused, chose her words. A place to start over. And you started over on my land? No. She met his eyes. I started over by keeping your land from going to the bank. He waited. I went to the county recorder when I saw the notice. I asked about the loan amount. She said a number. It was not a small number. It was the number Ethan had been losing sleep over for the 2 years before he went into the mountains. The number that had driven him up into those high passes, looking for the silver strike that 3 other men had told him was there, the number that had almost gotten him killed. You paid that, he said. I paid it. With what money that's? I know what it is. For the first time, something moved through her voice. Not anger. Closer to determination. I had some savings. Not enough. I took on work from 3 neighboring ranches, washing, mending, cooking for 4 months to make up the difference. And then I came out here, and I started working. Ethan put his coffee cup down. He looked at this woman, this stranger, this Clara Whitmore, with her steady eyes and her rough hands and her plain dress and her jaw set, like she was used to having people question her, and had long since stopped being surprised by it, and he said the only thing he could think to say. Why? She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, You don't remember me. He studied her face. He was honest about it. He let himself look, really look, the way a man looks at someone he's trying to place. Dark eyes, strong features, a small scar along the line of her left jaw, thin and old. I'm sorry, he said. I don't. She nodded like she'd expected that. 7 years ago, she said, I was coming through Cheyenne with my husband, James. We'd been trying to get to California. James was sick consumption, and we'd run out of money in Cheyenne, and the man who owned the boarding house was going to put us out in the street. She paused. You were there. You were passing through on your way home from a cattle sale. You heard me arguing with the landlord in the street outside. You didn't know me. You didn't know James. You walked over and you paid what we owed him. She stopped. $42. You told me it wasn't charity. You said someone had done the same for your father once, and you were just passing it along. And then you tipped your hat and you left. Ethan stared at her. The memory was gone. Completely gone. He'd done things like that, he had. It was true he'd been raised to. But he couldn't pull up that specific moment, that specific face, from the 20-some years of riding and working and moving through the West that sat behind his eyes. James died that winter, Clara said. He made it to California. We had 6 good months before the consumption took him. But we had those months because of what you did. She looked at the table. I always meant to pay it back. I had no way to find you. I didn't even know your full name for years. And then I saw that notice in the recorder's office, and I read the name Ethan Walker, and I just... She stopped again. I knew it was the same man. I don't know how. I just knew. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the cattle lowed from the pen. A crow called from somewhere up in the pines. The summer heat pressed against the windows and made the light thick and gold. $42, Ethan said finally. 14 months of work, she said. And the loan paid off. And 12 head of cattle. And a kitchen garden. A pause. I reckon we're even. He almost laughed. It surprised him, the almost laugh, the way it moved through him, before he caught it, because he hadn't been close to laughing in longer than he could remember. We are not even, he said. He spent the rest of that day walking the property. He needed to walk it, needed to put his boots on the ground and move through it, and let his hands touch things, fence rails, barn doors, the dry stone wall along the creek bank that his father had built before Ethan was born, because if he didn't touch things, he wasn't sure he'd believe they were real. Clara let him go. She went back to her work, which he came to understand was considerable. She had her own rhythm on this land, a daily pattern she'd built over 14 months of necessity, and she moved through it without wasted motion. She knew which gate stuck. She knew which section of the creek the cattle preferred in the afternoon. She knew where the tools were kept and why, and which ones needed sharpening. She knew his land better than he did right now. That thought landed on him somewhere around the east pasture, and he stood with it for a while. Margaret had known this land like that once. Not because she'd been born to it, she hadn't. She'd come from a family in Ohio with no connection to ranching, but because she'd learned it stubbornly and deliberately, the way she'd done everything. She'd asked Ethan questions about it for years. Which soil drains and which holds water? Which grass grows back after a hard winter and which doesn't? She'd kept a little notebook. He still had it somewhere. He hadn't been able to look at it in 3 years. Clara Whitmore wasn't Margaret. He wasn't confused about that. But there was something in the steadiness of her, the way she moved through this place without needing it to be anything other than what it was, that made something in him ache in a way that wasn't entirely grief. He filed that feeling away and kept walking. At supper, she put food on the table without making a ceremony of it. Salt pork and beans and cornbread. The same meal 1,000 ranch kitchens were making that evening across Colorado. Nothing special about it. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and it was served at his table in his house by a woman who had worked all day on his land and who set her own plate across from his without asking permission. He liked that. He didn't say so. "You'll want me to leave," she said, after they'd eaten for a few minutes in silence. Ethan looked up. "I've been thinking about where I'd go," she said. "Matter of fact, there's a woman in town who runs a seamstress shop. She's been talking about needing help. I didn't say I wanted you to leave." She stopped. He picked up his coffee cup. Put it down again. He was not a man who'd ever had an easy time finding the right words for things that mattered, and this mattered, so he was careful with it. "You paid off my note," he said. "You kept this place running for 14 months. You fixed the barn door and reposted the north fence and planted a garden and kept 12 head of cattle alive." He looked at her. "And you did all of that for a man you weren't sure was ever coming back. For a man you didn't know. For a debt you didn't actually owe, because $42 passed in a street 7 years ago doesn't require 14 months of work in return." Clara met his eyes and said nothing. "I'm not telling you to leave," Ethan said. "I'm telling you that what you did—" He stopped, started again. "I've been writing for 2 years with nothing, with less than nothing. I came back here to say goodbye to a piece of dirt because I thought there wasn't anything else left to say goodbye to." He looked at the window, the light going orange and slow outside. "I wasn't expecting this." "Wasn't expecting what?" He looked back at her. "Any of it," he said. "That I said." She didn't leave. Not that night and not the next morning. She was up before him. He heard her moving in the kitchen, heard the stove door open and close, smelled coffee. And when he came out, she had already been out to check the cattle and was standing at the kitchen window with her cup looking at the morning. "There's a problem with the East Creek," she said without turning around. "The water level's been dropping since June. I've been watching it. I think there's a blockage up in the high pasture, maybe a rockfall from the spring melt. If it doesn't get cleared before the end of summer, we'll be hauling water by September." He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the back of her head. She'd said. He wasn't sure she'd meant to. "I know that creek," he said. "There's a section about 2 miles up where the channel narrows. Rockfall could dam it easy. I tried to get up there last month, but I don't have a good mountain horse." She turned around, looked at him. "You do." He looked at her. "After breakfast," he said. She turned back to the window, and he thought he saw the edge of something move across her face just briefly in the morning light. Not quite a smile. Something less certain than that, but in the same direction. They rode up to the high pasture after breakfast, Ethan on Cutter, and Clara on a sturdy but flat-footed roan she called Bess, and Ethan picked the route and she followed without asking why he went the way he went, which he appreciated. He didn't explain himself well. He never had. They found the problem at the narrow section of the creek exactly where he'd expected it. A shelf of granite had sheared off the ridge above in the spring thaw and come down into the channel, diverting maybe 2/3 of the flow. The water was running around the edge of the rockfall and soaking into the hillside instead of coming down to the pasture. He stood at the edge of the creek and looked at it. "Needs to come out," he said. "I know," Clara said. "It's too heavy for me to shift alone. I tried." He looked at her, at the rocks, at the dry line on the creek bank where the water level had been 2 months ago. "We can lever the big ones," he said. "Take a few hours." "I know," she said again. They worked through the heat of the morning. Ethan cut 2 long poles from the timber at the edge of the pasture, and they used them to move Rock Ethan on the heavier end and Clara on the other, calling out to each other when they were ready to push and when they needed to reset. It was hard work, dirty work, the kind of work that didn't leave room for conversation because all the breath went into the effort. But it was good in a way that Ethan hadn't felt in a long time. Good like having a purpose. Good like having someone next to you who was doing their share. He watched her work sideways when she wasn't looking, and he watched the way she set her feet and put her weight into the pole and didn't quit. When a rock didn't shift the first time, just reset and tried again, and something in him was quietly rearranging itself in ways he couldn't quite name. By midday, they had the channel clear. The water came down in a rush brown with disturbed sediment at first, and then clearing, and it ran down the slope the way it was supposed to run, the way it had run every summer of Ethan's entire life. Clara sat on a rock and pushed her hair back off her face and looked at the water. "Good," she said. Just that. One word. Ethan sat on the bank across from her with his boots in the cold water and looked at the creek running clear and thought about a man who had gone into these mountains looking for silver and found nothing, who had spent 2 years becoming less than he'd started, as who had ridden south over this last ridge 3 days ago, with nothing in his chest but the gray ash of something that used to be hope. He thought about smoke rising from his chimney. He looked at Clara Whitmore sitting on a rock with her boots muddy and her hair loose and the afternoon sun on her face. "Why did you really stay?" he asked. She looked at him. "I told you why." "You told me the debt," he said. "That's not the whole of it." She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran between them cold and clear. "After James died," she said, "I spent 4 years being nobody's anything. Nobody's wife, nobody's neighbor. I worked in other people's houses and other people's businesses, and I slept in other people's rooms, and I was—" She stopped. "I was invisible, and I got used to being invisible, which is the worst part. You stop expecting to matter." She looked at the creek. "When I came out here and started working this land, I mattered. Not to anyone else. Just—" She touched the wet rock beside her. "To this place. To these cattle. To the garden that needed watering." A pause. "It's the first time in 4 years that something needed me." Ethan looked at her for a long time. "It still does," he said. She looked up. He wasn't sure which direction that was going, and neither was she, and they both seemed to understand that at the same moment, because neither of them said anything else for a while. They just sat on either side of the creek and let the water run between them. And above them the summer sky was wide and blue, and the pines smelled hot and sharp, and for the first time in 2 years, Ethan Walker did not feel like a man who had come home to say goodbye. 3 days after Ethan came back, Roy Bellows rode up the lane. Ethan was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard the horse, and he came around front with the axe still in his hand. Not threatening, just practical, because he'd been in the middle of something, and he looked at the man on the gray horse. And the man on the gray horse looked at him and went very still. "You're dead," Bellows said. "I get that a lot lately," Ethan said. Roy Bellows was the land agent for the Cattlemen's Trust, a thick-set man with a waxed mustache and the kind of eyes that were always calculating something. He'd been the one to file the default notice. Ethan didn't know that yet, he'd learn it later from Clara, but he knew a bank man when he saw one, and he knew from the way Bellows was looking at him that something was about to go sideways. "Mr. Walker." Bellows dismounted with the deliberateness of a man buying himself time. "This is well. This is a surprise. I imagine it is. We were given to understand that you'd perished in the—" I didn't. Bellows smiled. It was the kind of smile that had never touched anything behind it. Well, that's wonderful news. Truly. However, he paused. The matter of the outstanding note. The default was filed legally, and the trust has a legitimate... The note was paid, Clara said. She had come around from the garden side, still holding her trowel, and she stood at the edge of the porch and looked at Bellows with the same steadiness she brought to everything. Bellows looked at her. Something crossed his face that Ethan didn't like. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, the trust is aware of your arrangement, and while it was a... He seemed to search for a word. Generous gesture, the legality of a private individual paying a note in default on behalf of a deceased owner is... He isn't deceased, Clara said. He wasn't legally documented as alive at the time of the payment, which means... What it means, Ethan said, is that my land was never the trust's to take. I'm alive. The note is paid. You're standing on my property without an invitation. He looked at Bellows, kept his voice level. I'd like you to leave. Bellows looked at him, looked at the axe in his hand, looked at Clara on the porch. Mr. Walker, the Cattlemen's Trust has considerable interest in this region, and I would strongly advise you to... Roy. Ethan stepped forward. Just one step. He didn't raise the axe. He didn't raise his voice. He just moved forward the way a mountain moves when a mountain decides to move. I have been polite. I've let you finish your sentences. I've listened to what the trust has to say. He stopped with about 10 feet between them. I am telling you plainly and once that this land belongs to me, that the debt against it has been paid in full with a receipt from the county recorder, and that whatever game the Cattlemen's Trust is looking to play out here, you're going to need to find a different board. He looked the man in the eye. Now get off my land. Bellows got on his horse. He rode slowly, the way men ride. When they want you to know, they'll be back. And Ethan watched him go until the gray horse disappeared around the bend. Then he looked at Clara. She was still holding the trowel. He'll be back, she said. Yep. With papers, probably. And a lawyer. Probably. She looked at him. Are you worried? Ethan turned back to the woodpile. The receipt is real, he said. The note is paid. The land is mine. He picked up the axe again. And I'm here now. He split a log. That changes things, he said. Clara looked at him for another moment. Then she went back to her garden. And the summer moved over the Walker homestead like something that was just beginning. Roy Bellows came back on a Thursday. Ethan knew he would. Men like Bellows always came back on a Thursday or some day, just like it, a day when the heat was up and the work was heavy and a man was already tired before the trouble arrived. He came back with a rider beside him, a younger man in a town coat who carried a leather satchel and had the look of someone who'd learned everything he knew about the West from reading about it somewhere east of the Mississippi. Ethan set down his fence post and waited. He didn't walk toward them. He let them come to him. Mr. Walker. Bellows pulled up and tipped his hat with the kind of courtesy that meant nothing. This is Mr. Aldridge. He represents the Cattlemen's Trust in legal matters. Aldridge opened his satchel before his horse had fully stopped moving, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about how this was going to go. Mr. Walker, Aldridge said, and his voice had the flat precision of a man who charged by the hour. I've reviewed the payment made on behalf of your property by a Mrs. Clara Whitmore on September the 4th, 1884, and I'm afraid there are some significant concerns regarding its validity. The payment was accepted by the county recorder, Ethan said. It was accepted provisionally. It was accepted, Ethan said. In full. I have the receipt. Aldridge smiled the way lawyers smiled when they were about to tell you a smile was the wrong response. The issue, Mr. Walker, is not the payment itself, but the standing of the individual who made it. Mrs. Whitmore had no legal relationship to this property, no power of attorney, no documented connection to the estate of... I'm not an estate, Ethan said. I'm standing right here. At the time of the payment, the trust had a reasonable basis to believe the trust was wrong. Ethan looked at Bellows. Not at Aldridge. At Bellows, because Bellows was the one who mattered. Bellows was the one who'd filed the default. Bellows was the one who'd ridden up this lane with something in his eyes that Ethan recognized as appetite. And the trust knows it was wrong. That's why you brought a lawyer instead of a sheriff. Something moved through Bellows's face that he didn't quite manage to hide. The trust would be willing to consider a settlement, Aldridge said smoothly. Given the unusual circumstances, we could offer to get off my land, Ethan said. Aldridge blinked. Mr. Walker, if you'd simply allow me to... I've heard what you came to say. He looked at Aldridge now. You came to tell me a legal theory that might or might not hold water in a county court, and you came to say it while I'm standing in my own pasture holding a fence post, because men like you know that tired men make bad decisions. He picked up the post again. I'm not tired enough for that. Come back with a court order or don't come back at all. Bellows's jaw tightened. This isn't finished, he said. Probably not, Ethan agreed. But today it is. He turned his back on both of them and went back to work. He listened to the horses leave without watching them go. When they were gone, he stood with the post in his hands and let himself feel the thing he hadn't let himself feel while they were watching him. The cold knot of it, the way it sat in his gut, like something swallowed wrong. He'd been back a week, 1 week, and already the thing he'd fought his way off a mountain to come back to was in danger of being taken from him by men who wore suits and carried satchels and had never put their hands in the dirt of anything they owned. He heard footsteps behind him. Clara. She'd been in the barn when they rode up. He'd seen her stop in the barn doorway and stay there watching, and he'd been glad she hadn't come out because her being there would have given Bellows something to use. I heard, she said. I figured. She stood beside him, not touching, just present. How much trouble are we in? He thought about that honestly. I don't know yet, he said. Depends on who their judge is. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I kept every record, every payment, every receipt, the date I went to the recorder's office, the name of the man who accepted the payment. She paused. I wrote everything down because I knew from the day I signed that paper that someone was going to come back around and try to say it didn't count. Ethan looked at her. You knew. I'm a woman who paid off a dead man's debt on land that wasn't hers, she said, and her voice was even, but underneath it was something with edges. I knew. He looked at her for a long moment, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her eyes, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned that the world didn't offer much in the way of softness and had decided that was fine, and something moved through him that was complicated and real, and not something he was anywhere near ready to name. Show me the records, he said. She showed him. They sat at the kitchen table that evening, with every paper she'd kept spread out between them, and Ethan went through them slowly while Clara explained each one. She'd kept the original receipt from the county recorder's office, along with a copy she'd made herself in her own handwriting. She'd kept the bank draft, the ledger entries from the neighboring ranches where she'd worked, and a letter from the recorder himself, a man named Hutchins, dated November of 1884, acknowledging the payment and confirming clear title. She'd also kept something Ethan hadn't expected. A letter, handwritten 4 pages addressed to no one addressed, he realized as he read it to him. To Ethan Walker. Written in the first month after she'd arrived at the property, when she still didn't know if he was dead or alive, and was apparently talking to him anyway. He got 3 lines in and stopped. He set the letter face down on the table. You don't have to read that, Clara said quickly. I didn't mean to include that. That was for me. It was for me, he said. You addressed it to me. She looked at the table. I was alone out here. I needed to... She stopped. I needed to explain myself to someone even if that someone wasn't there. He didn't pick the letter back up. He left it face down. But he thought about it for a long time after that. The next morning, Ethan saddled Cutter before breakfast and rode into Harlow, which was the nearest town of any consequence 7 miles down the valley road. He went to see a man named Gideon Cross, who was not a lawyer exactly, but who had spent 30 years in Larimer County knowing more about land law than most lawyers did, and who had a reputation for being unable to be bought, which in 1885 was a rarer quality than gold. Cross was in his usual chair on the porch of the land office when Ethan rode up. He was a small, narrow man somewhere north of 70, with white hair and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of human nature to have stopped being surprised by any of it. "Heard you were back," Cross said. "Heard you were supposed to be dead." "Rumor?" Ethan said. Cross looked at him. "Bellows been out to see you." "Yesterday. Brought a lawyer named Aldridge." Cross made a sound in his throat. "Aldridge. Yes. The trust has been using him for the better part of 3 years now. He's good at what he does, which is finding the weakest point of any legal position and pushing on it until something breaks." He looked at Ethan. "What's your position?" Ethan laid it out. All of it. Clara's payment, the recorder's receipt. Hutchins' letter, the records she'd kept. Cross listened without interrupting, which was the sign of a man who was actually listening, rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. When Ethan finished, Cross sat for a moment. "The trust's argument," he said, "is going to be that a payment made by a party with no legal standing to the property doesn't constitute satisfaction of the note. That when Clara Whitmore paid that debt, she wasn't paying it on your behalf, she was paying it on her own behalf, possibly to establish a squatter's claim. And that since you were presumed dead and the default was legally filed." "The presumption was wrong," Ethan said. "Presumptions often are. Doesn't make them less effective in court." Cross looked at him. "You're going to need Hutchins to testify." The county recorder himself confirming he accepted the payment as satisfaction of the note on the Walker property. If Hutchins holds, the trust's argument falls apart. If Hutchins wavers... He paused. "Bellows has a lot of influence with the men in this county who want to stay comfortable." Ethan understood what he wasn't saying. "You think Bellows will go after Hutchins?" "I think Bellows will go after everything," Cross said. "That's who Roy Bellows is. He doesn't stop when you tell him to stop. He stops when something stops him." The old man looked at Ethan for a moment. "Who is this woman, Whitmore?" "She's..." Ethan paused. "She kept my land alive for 14 months while I was presumed dead. She paid off my note with her own money and her own work." "Why?" "Long answer." Cross studied him. "You trust her?" The question landed plainly the way Cross asked everything without decoration. Ethan thought about Clara's records spread across his kitchen table, about 4 pages of a letter she'd written to a dead man, about the way she'd stood in the barn doorway watching Bellows ride up and hadn't run out to say the wrong thing, even though she probably wanted to. "Yes," he said. Cross nodded as if that settled something. "Then here's what you do," he said. Ethan rode home with a plan, and the plan was simple, the way plans have to be simple if they're going to work when they're tested. Get Hutchins on record in writing in front of a witness Cross would supply. File a counterclaim with the circuit court establishing Ethan's legal status as the living owner of the Walker property. And don't let Bellows get near Hutchins before that happened. He told Clara all of it at supper. She listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, her hands still around her coffee cup, her eyes on his face. When he finished, she said, "Hutchins is a good man. He won't lie." "I know. But there's a difference between a good man who won't lie and a good man who won't be pressured. Bellows knows which buttons to push. So we get to Hutchins first. Tomorrow morning." She nodded. Then Ethan. It was the first time she'd used his name without the formality of Mr. in front of it, and something about it made him look at her directly. "I'm sorry," she said, "that all of this landed on you the week you came home. You came back here to..." She stopped. "This isn't the homecoming you deserved." He looked at her for a moment. "I came back here to say goodbye," he said. "This is considerably better than that." Something changed in her face. Not a smile exactly. Clara didn't smile easily. He was learning, and he was also learning that the rare time she did it was worth the wait. But something warm moved through her expression, and she looked down at her coffee cup, and he thought he might have seen the edge of it. He didn't push it. He just drank his coffee and let the evening settle around them, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that coming home had stopped feeling like a mistake somewhere in the last 7 days. They rode into Harlow the next morning, both of them, Ethan on Cutter and Clara on Bess, and they went to the county recorder's office where Edgar Hutchins sat behind his desk with the look of a man who had been expecting this visit. Hutchins was maybe 55, a careful man, the kind who wore the same suit every day because consistency was its own form of integrity. He stood when Clara came in, which Ethan noticed, and he shook Ethan's hand with both of his, which was not a casual gesture. "I heard you were alive," Hutchins said. "I was glad to hear it. I was also not entirely surprised." "Why's that?" Ethan asked. "Because this woman," Hutchins looked at Clara, "did not strike me as someone who does things without good reason. When she came in and paid that note in September, she looked me square in the eye and told me that Ethan Walker was either alive or had been alive, and that either way the land belonged to him, and she was making sure it stayed that way." He paused. "I believed her." Clara looked at Hutchins. "I wasn't certain you did." "I know," he said. "I was careful about it. I needed to be careful. There were," he chose the word slowly, "pressures, after the fact. Bellows came to see me in October, asked me questions about the payment." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that were meant to make me doubt whether I'd done the right thing." Hutchins looked at him. "I sent him away. But I want you to understand that he will be back, and next time, he may not come alone." "We know," Ethan said. "That's why we're here. Gideon Cross is going to need a signed statement." "I've already prepared one," Hutchins said. He slid a folded document across the desk. Ethan opened it and read it. 3 pages, precise and careful, laying out every detail of Clara's payment. His acceptance of it the legal basis for his decision, and his unambiguous statement that the note on the Walker property had been satisfied in full, and the title was clear. He looked up at Hutchins. "You prepared this before we came. Cross sent word yesterday evening that you'd been to see him." Hutchins folded his hands on the desk. "I've been waiting for someone to sort this out properly since October. I am glad it's happening now rather than later." Clara looked at the document in Ethan's hands. Something had shifted in her expression. Something that looked like relief, the kind that costs a person something to feel because it means they'd been holding their breath for longer than they'd admitted. Ethan set the document back on Hutchins' desk and looked at the recorder. "Sign it in front of Cross's witness," he said. "Today." "I'll go now," Hutchins said, and he reached for his hat. They walked out of the recorder's office into the mid-morning heat of Harlow's main street. And for a moment, both of them stood on the boardwalk without speaking. The town moved around them. Wagons, horses, 2 women outside the dry goods store, a dog sleeping in the narrow shade of a hitching post. And it was all ordinary. And it all felt slightly unreal the way things feel when something important has just shifted, and the world hasn't caught up to it yet. "That was easier than I expected," Clara said. "The easy part is done," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Bellows isn't going to walk away from this," he said. "The trust has money and time and lawyers, and none of those things run out fast. Hutchins' statement gives us a strong position, but strong positions get attacked." He looked down the street toward the opposite end of town, where the Cattlemen's Trust maintained a small office above the feed store. "We need to be smarter than them and faster than them, and we need to not give them anything to use against us." Clara followed his gaze. "What are they going to try next?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But I want to know before they do it." He looked at her. "You said you worked at 3 neighboring ranches when you were raising money for the note. Kerrigan south of here, the Alderbeck place east, and Old Stout's outfit up past the ridge. Those men know you." "They do. And they know the land, know who belongs to it, and who doesn't." He looked at her. "Word travels out here. If the trust tries to move on something, tries to pressure someone, or buy someone, or file something in court, someone in this valley is going to know about it before it gets to us." He paused. "I need to ride out to those ranches, talk to those men, not ask for favors, just let them know I'm back and I'm staying, and I'd appreciate knowing if anything comes across their ears." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Kerrigan will talk to you," she said. "He's a straight man. He didn't like what Bellows did last spring, tried to get Kerrigan to sell off the north section of his land for railroad access rights. Kerrigan told him where to put the offer." She almost smiled. "He used different language." "Good." Ethan looked back at the trust's office. "What about Bellows himself? What do you know about him personally?" She thought about it. "He's been in Larimer County about 5 years. Came from somewhere back east Denver maybe, or further east than that. He works for the trust, but he's not just a hired man. He's got something in this, some personal stake in acquiring land in this valley. I've heard it said that he's buying on his own account, in addition to what he does for the trust, but I've never seen proof of that." "If he's buying on his own account," Ethan said slowly, "then this isn't just about a banknote." "No?" Clara said. "I don't think it ever was." That sat between them for a moment on the boardwalk in the heat and the noise of an ordinary morning in Harlow, and Ethan felt the shape of something larger moving beneath the surface of this situation. Something that had been in motion before he'd come back. Something that Clara had been standing in the middle of for over a year without fully understanding its dimensions. "You've been holding this alone," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "For 14 months. You didn't just keep the land running. You were holding off whatever this is." He gestured back toward the trust's office. "By yourself, without knowing the full shape of it." Clara looked away. "It wasn't your problem to fix," she said. "You were gone. I'm here now." She looked back at him. "I know," she said quietly. They rode out to Kerrigan's that afternoon. Tom Kerrigan was a big weathered man with red in his beard going gray, and hands that looked like they'd been borrowed from something larger. He came out of his barn when he heard them ride up, and he looked at Ethan Walker with the particular expression of a man seeing a ghost and deciding the ghost is welcome. "Well," Kerrigan said, "you're harder to kill than advertised." "So people keep telling me," Ethan said. They shook hands. Kerrigan's grip was the kind that meant something. "Come inside," he said. "Mary's got coffee on, and you look like a man who's got more to talk about than the weather." They sat in Kerrigan's kitchen, and Ethan laid out the situation plainly, and Kerrigan listened with his elbows on the table and his jaw getting tighter as the telling went on. By the time Ethan was done, Kerrigan's wife Mary had put down her work and was listening too, and both of them had the look of people who had been waiting for someone to say out loud what they'd been thinking quietly. "I've been watching Bellows work this valley for 2 years, Kerrigan said. "He's not buying for the trust alone. I told you." He looked at Clara. "I told you in April that something was wrong with the pattern." "You did," Clara said. "He's going after the water," Kerrigan said flatly. He looked at Ethan. "Not the land. The water. Your creek, the Walker Creek, that feeds down through 6 properties in this valley, including mine. Whoever controls the headwaters of that creek controls the summer grazing in this whole section." He leaned forward. "Bellows knows that. The trust knows that. And they've been trying to acquire your land specifically because it sits at the top of that water system." Ethan went very still. The creek he and Clara had cleared the week before, 2 miles up in the high pasture. The channel they'd levered rock from in the afternoon heat while the water ran cold and clear between them. "That's what this is about," Ethan said. "That's what this has always been about," Kerrigan said. "Your land isn't worth what Bellows is paying for the lawyers just for the cattle. It's worth what he's paying because of the water." Clara had gone quiet across the table. Ethan looked at her and saw the thing running behind her eyes, the recalculation, the way this new information was settling into the picture she'd been looking at for 14 months and rearranging everything. "He would have come for the land even if Ethan had been alive," she said. "Probably," Kerrigan said. "He would have made a low offer first. When it was refused, he would have found another way." He looked at Ethan. "The avalanche that took you up on Emmons, did anyone know you were going up that pass?" The question landed like a cold hand on the back of Ethan's neck. He thought about it. He'd told a man in town, a man at the supply store where he'd gone to pick up provisions before heading up into the high country looking for the silver strike. He hadn't thought anything of it. It was a small town. People talked. "Someone knew," he said. Someone always does, Kerrigan said. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. Something was being said between them that neither of them put into words because it was the kind of thing that needed a moment to sit in before anyone reached for language to describe it. I need to know who knew I was going up that mountain, Ethan said. That was almost 2 years ago. I know. People don't hold on to that kind of detail. Some people do, Ethan said. Bellows does. Men like him keep records of everything that might be useful later. He looked at Kerrigan. If he planned this, if he somehow arranged for me to be alone in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's a serious thing to say, Kerrigan said carefully. I know it is. You'd need proof. I know that too. Ethan sat back. He breathed. He let himself feel the size of what was in front of him. Not panic, not anger, just the clear-eyed understanding of it, the way a man looks at a mountain. He's going to have to climb, and measures it honestly. One thing at a time. The statement from Hutchins goes to Cross today. We establish clear title. We handle the legal piece first, and we handle it solid, so that whatever else Bellows tries to do, the land is secure. And then, Clara asked. He looked at her. And then we find out what else he's been doing in this valley, he said. And we make sure he doesn't get to do any more of it. Kerrigan nodded slowly. You've got friends out here, Walker, he said. More than you probably knew before you left. This valley's been getting squeezed for 2 years, and people are tired of it. He looked at Ethan steadily. You coming back matters. Not just to your land, to this whole section. Ethan heard that. He heard the weight of it, and he didn't deflect it or minimize it, because Kerrigan wasn't the kind of man who said things he didn't mean. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan said. Kerrigan put out his hand. Ethan shook it. They rode home in the long light of the late afternoon. Ethan and Clara side by side on the valley road, with the summer smell of cut grass and warm dust around them, and they didn't talk much for the first couple of miles. Sometimes silence between people means there's nothing to say. And sometimes it means there's too much, and the right words haven't come yet, and both people know it, and wait. Clara broke it. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask it. She was quiet for another moment. When Kerrigan said what he said about someone knowing you were going up that mountain, she paused. Were you scared? Ethan thought about it honestly. Not scared, he said. Something else. Something that feels like... He searched for it. Like the ground shifting under something you thought was solid. She nodded. I felt that too. When I paid off the note, I thought I understood what I was doing. I thought I was paying a debt and keeping a piece of land from going to a bank. She looked ahead at the road. I didn't know I was standing in the middle of something that big. Something that had been planned. You might have saved my life, he said. She looked at him sharply. I kept your land. If Bellows got this land, he said, and I came riding back to nothing with no legal standing and no title and no position to argue from. He paused. A man with nothing left is a man with no reason to make trouble, and a man with no reason to make trouble is a man who goes away. He looked at her. Or gets made to. Clara held his gaze. Then I'm glad I stayed, she said. Ethan looked at the road ahead of them. So am I, he said. The Walker homestead came into view around the last bend, and the smoke was rising from the chimney the way it had been rising since he'd come home since she'd made it rise, and the evening light caught the windows and made them warm, and the cattle were moving slow in the pen. The way cattle do at the end of a summer day, and Ethan Walker looked at all of it and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt like it was worth fighting for, not because it was land, not because it was money or cattle or water rights or any of the things that Bellows and the Trust had reduced it to in their calculations, but because it was a place where things were alive and tended and cared for, because someone had looked at it when it was failing and decided it deserved to keep going, because he had come back to a home that had been kept by a woman who didn't owe him anything and who had given him everything anyway. Clara, he said, She looked at him. Whatever comes next. He paused. Got it right. I don't want to face it without you beside me. She looked at him for a long moment, and the evening was quiet around them, and then she said, You won't have to. They rode in together. Gideon Cross filed the counterclaim with the circuit court on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon the whole of Harlow knew about it. That was the thing about small towns in 1885. News didn't travel. It erupted. One man told two men at the feed store, and those two men told their wives, and by supper, there wasn't a household within 7 miles that didn't know Ethan Walker was alive, was back, and was fighting the Cattlemen's Trust for his land with a county recorder's signed statement, and a woman who'd kept the place running for over a year while everyone else had written him off for dead. Ethan found out how fast the news had spread when he rode into Harlow the next morning, and 3 men he barely recognized stopped him on the street to shake his hand. He didn't know what to do with that exactly. He'd been gone long enough that goodwill felt unfamiliar, like a coat he'd outgrown and found again and wasn't sure still fit. He thanked them and kept moving because there was work to do, and warmth, however genuine, didn't clear titles or stop bank lawyers. Cross was waiting for him at the land office with his hat already on. Bellows filed a response, Cross said, before Ethan had fully come through the door. This morning. Early. Ethan stopped. That was fast. He had it prepared. Cross looked at him steadily. He filed it before we filed our claim, Ethan. He had the response written before he knew we'd filed. The cold thing settled into Ethan's gut again. He knew we were coming. He knew something was coming. He's been watching this situation since October. When you rode into town yesterday, someone told someone, and word got to Bellows before the ink was dry on our paperwork. Cross put the document on the desk between them. Read the filing. Ethan read it. It was thorough, more thorough than it should have been for something produced in a morning. It challenged the validity of Clara's payment on 3 separate legal grounds, questioned Edgar Hutchins's authority to accept payment from a third party. And this was the part that made Ethan's jaw tighten, introduced a counter-argument that Clara Whitmore herself had filed false documentation with the county recorder in order to establish a fraudulent claim on property that was in legal default. They weren't just going after the land anymore. They were going after Clara. This is an accusation of fraud, Ethan said. It is. Against a woman who paid off a legitimate debt with her own money and kept a man's land alive while he was presumed dead. Yes. Cross sat down. And it is a deliberate strategy because they know that if they can establish any question of fraud in the payment, any ambiguity at all, the original default stands, the title reverts, and they don't have to prove anything else. He looked at Ethan. They're not going after the land anymore. You're right. They're going after the person who stands between them and the land. Ethan set the document down. He thought about Clara at his kitchen table with her records spread out. About the letter she'd written to a dead man because she needed to explain herself to someone. About 14 months of work on land that wasn't hers in a legal position she'd understood was fragile from the beginning, holding it together with careful documentation and sheer stubbornness. He thought about Kerrigan's question. Did anyone know you were going up that mountain? I need to know something, Ethan said, and I need you to be straight with me. When am I not? Cross said. If Bellows gets this in front of a judge of his choosing, what are the chances that Clara's payment gets ruled invalid? Cross was quiet for a moment. Higher than I'd like, he said. The law on third-party debt satisfaction is genuinely unsettled in this territory. There's no clear precedent either way. A sympathetic judge rules in our favor. A judge who's been spoken to. He paused. I don't know what we'd get. Which judges does Bellows have access to? That's a harder question than it sounds. I know. Answer it anyway. Cross looked at him for a long moment. Judge Harker in Fort Collins has taken decisions favorable to the trust in the past. Not necessarily corrupted, just conservative, and the trust's arguments tend to be conservative ones. He paused. If the case goes to Harker, I'd give us even odds at best. And if it goes to someone else, The Circuit Judge Morrison comes through this territory in October. He's a fair man. I've seen him rule against railroad interests twice in 3 years, which tells you something about his spine." Cross folded his hands. "If we can get this in front of Morrison, we win. Then we need to make sure it goes to Morrison. That's not entirely within our control." "Nothing is," Ethan said. "Do what you can." He rode home with the filing in his saddlebag and the weight of it sitting on his shoulders the way the altitude sat on a man's lungs in the high passes. Not crushing. Just present a constant reminder that the air up here was thinner than it looked. Clara was in the kitchen when he got back. She looked at his face when he came through the door and she said, "What happened?" Not a question. She read it in him the way she read the land directly without fuss, without softening it for herself. He put the document on the table. She read it. He watched her read it. He watched the stillness that came over her face, the particular stillness of someone who is receiving bad news and has enough dignity not to let it knock them sideways in front of another person. She read to the end. She set the document down. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, "They're saying I committed fraud." "Yes. I have every receipt, every record. I have Hutchins' signed statement." "I know." "And they're still saying I committed fraud." Her voice was even, too even, the kind of even that cost something. "Because that's the only argument they have left. Not because they believe it, because it might work." "Yes," Ethan said. She put both hands flat on the table, looked at them. "If a judge rules against me," she said, "it's not just the land, it's a fraud finding. That follows a person." She looked up. "I'd never work in this county again. I'd never work anywhere respectable again. A woman with a fraud finding against her name." She stopped. "That's not going to happen," Ethan said. "You don't know that. I know we're going to fight it. Fighting it isn't winning it." She looked at him. Her eyes were steady, but something behind them was working hard. "I knew this was a risk when I did it, Ethan. I knew the legal position was complicated. I made a choice, and I'm not sorry for it." She paused. "But I didn't expect them to come at me like this." He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. "Listen to me," he said. "They're going after you because you're the piece of this they think they can break. They looked at the situation and they decided that you are the soft point that a woman alone, without a legal claim, without family in this county, without a name, people know." He stopped. "Let that land. They think you're easier to move than I am. That's the only reason for this filing." She looked at him. "Are they right?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Not while I'm here," he said. Something moved through her face. Not relief too complicated for that. Something that was relief and gratitude, and something else layered together, something she pulled back from the edge of and decided not to say out loud. "What do we do?" she asked. "We go see Hutchins again, today. And this time, I want him to write a second statement, not just confirming the payment, but specifically addressing the fraud allegation. Line by line. Every point they raised, he answers it directly." He looked at her. "And then we go back to Kerrigan, and we ask him to think hard about who else in this valley has had dealings with Bellows, who else he's pressured, who else has a story." He paused. "Because if Bellows has been doing this here, he's done it before. And if he's done it before, there are people out there who can speak to his methods." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You're building a case against him," she said. "I'm building a case for us," he said. "Which means building a case against him, yes." She nodded slowly. "Then we'd better start," she said. They went to see Hutchins that afternoon, and Hutchins read the trust's filing with the expression of a man who was personally offended by the quality of the argument being made against him. He sat up very straight, and he said in a voice that had gone clipped and precise, "They are questioning my competence and my integrity simultaneously. That is a significant mistake." "Can you answer it?" Ethan asked. "I can answer it in 4 pages, and I will enjoy every word," Hutchins said. While Hutchins wrote, Ethan and Clara sat in the anteroom of the recorder's office and waited, and the waiting had a different quality than the other silences between them. It was tighter, more alive, the silence of two people who are in something together and both know it. "Tell me about James," Ethan said. Clara looked at him. "You don't have to," he said. You've been alone a long time. And I don't know enough about you, and I'd like to." She considered him for a moment. "James was a good man," she said. "Kind. Too gentle for the West, maybe, which I mean as a compliment, because the West could stand to be more gentle." She looked at her hands. "He wanted to be a school teacher in California. That's why we were going. He'd been writing to a school in Sacramento for 2 years, and they'd finally offered him a position." She paused. "He made it. He taught for 4 months before the consumption got too bad. The children adored him." She was quiet for a moment. "He died in February of 1879. I was 26. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "It was a long time ago." She said it the way people say things that are still with them, but that they've learned to carry. "After he died, I stayed in Sacramento for a year. Then I started moving, looking for—" She paused. "I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I hadn't found it yet." She looked at him. "And then I saw your name on that notice in the recorder's office, and something told me to stop." Ethan looked at her. "Something," he said. "Don't make it into more than it was," she said, but the edge in her voice was soft, almost gentle. "It was a feeling. I followed it. I'm stubborn that way." "I've noticed," he said. She looked at him, and this time the almost smile made it further than usual before she pulled it back. Hutchins came out of his office 40 minutes later with 4 pages of dense, precise, unambiguous text that addressed every point in the trust's filing with the specificity of a man who kept meticulous records and was furious that someone had suggested otherwise. He signed it in front of Cross's witness, who had been waiting in the corner with the patience of someone paid to wait, and he handed the original to Ethan with the gravity of a man handing over a weapon. "Use it well," Hutchins said. "I intend to," Ethan said. They were halfway back to the Walker homestead when they saw the smoke. Not chimney smoke. Wrong direction, wrong color, dark and thick, and rising from the east, from somewhere in the direction of the high pasture. And Clara saw it at the same moment Ethan did, and they both pushed their horses without saying a word. The rockfall section of the creek, where they'd cleared the channel 2 weeks ago, where the water came down from the headwaters of the Walker Creek and fed into the valley system that watered 6 properties including Kerrigan's. Someone had redammed it, not with rocks this time, with a constructed barrier, logs and earth and stone deliberately placed blocking the channel and diverting the water off to the east away from the pasture. And beside the barrier, the remnants of a small fire where someone had camped for long enough to do this work, and boot tracks in the mud, and the clear evidence of at least 3 men with tools. Ethan stood at the edge of the blocked creek and looked at what had been done to it. Clara stood beside him. "They did this last night," she said, "while we were in town, while we were dealing with the filing." "They did this as the filing," Ethan said. She looked at him. "The legal challenge was the distraction," he said. "Keep us in town, keep us looking at papers, and send men up here to block the water. Because even if we win in court," he looked at the barrier, "even if the title is clear and the payment stands, if they control the water coming off this land, they control the land." "Can they do that legally?" "No," he said. "Water rights in this territory flow with the land. They can't legally divert this creek without our permission." He looked at the barrier. "But they don't need to be legal forever. They just need to be legal long enough to cause damage. Long enough to put Kerrigan's herd under stress. Long enough for the other downstream properties to start losing stock. Long enough to make us look like the problem." Clara was very still. "If the downstream ranchers think our land is cutting off their water, they stop being our allies," Ethan said. "And they start being pressure on us. Kerrigan, Alderbeck, Stout, all of them come to us asking why their cattle are going dry, and we're the ones who look like we're holding the water back." He looked at her. "Bellows turns our neighbors into our opponents without lifting a legal finger." "How fast?" "Kerrigan's herd will feel it in a week. Maybe less. Clara turned and looked at the barrier. She walked to it and put her hands on the logs and tested the weight of one and looked at the way it was set. "We can clear this," she said. "Same as the rockfall." "We clear it today. They'll rebuild it tomorrow," Ethan said. "We need to clear it and then make sure they can't rebuild it. Which means someone needs to be up here watching this section until this is settled." "I'll come up." "Clara, I know this land better than you do right now," she said flatly. "Not unkind, just true. I know which hours the shadows move in up here, and I know where a man can shelter overnight, and I know how to listen for sounds that don't belong." She looked at him. "I can watch this section. Alone, if I need to." He looked at her for a long moment, and what he felt was complicated pride and fear sitting right next to each other, the way they do when you're looking at someone doing something that matters and you're not sure you can protect them from what it costs. "You're not doing this alone," he said. "Then come with me." He looked at the barrier. He looked at the sky, reading the hours left in the day. He looked at Clara. "We clear this first," he said. "Then we ride to Kerrigan and tell him what's happening. He needs to know today before he starts seeing his water drop and draws the wrong conclusion. And tonight, he said, we figure out who was up here doing Bellows' dirty work." They cleared the barrier in 2 hours of hard work, and the creek ran again the way it was supposed to run. And Ethan stood back and looked at it, and felt nothing like satisfaction, because he knew it would be blocked again, and the fight wasn't won, it was just reset. They rode to Kerrigan's as the afternoon stretched long and thin, and Kerrigan came out to meet them before they'd dismounted, which meant he'd been watching for them, which meant he'd already noticed something. "My south trough is running low," he said. "We know," Ethan said. "Someone blocked the Walker Creek last night. Deliberate. Constructed barrier." Kerrigan's face went hard. "Bellows. His men. We cleared it this afternoon. They'll be back. I know." Ethan looked at him. "Tom, I need you to be clear on what's happening here. This isn't just about my land anymore. Bellows is moving against the whole valley water system. If he gets the Walker property, he controls the headwaters. Every ranch downstream is at his mercy." He paused. "He knows that. That's why he wants my land specifically. That's what this has always been about." Kerrigan was quiet for a moment. Behind him, his wife Mary had come to the doorway and was listening. "What do you need?" Kerrigan said. "Eyes," Ethan said. "And testimony. If this goes in front of a judge, and it's going in front of a judge, I need men who can speak to what Bellows has been doing in this valley. The pressure he's put on people. The offers that weren't really offers. Everything." He looked at Kerrigan steadily. "And I need to know who his men are. The ones who built that barrier last night. Someone in this valley knows them." Kerrigan nodded slowly. "There's a man named Cord," he said. "Works odd jobs for anyone who'll pay him. Big man, dark beard, rides a sorrel with a white blaze. I've seen him on Bellows' place twice in the last 2 months." He paused. "And there are 2 others brothers the Fitch boys come down from the mountains in the summers looking for wage work. Bellows has used them before." "Cord," Ethan repeated. "He drinks at the saloon in Harlow most evenings." Kerrigan looked at him. "I'm not telling you to do anything unwise." "I'm not going to do anything unwise," Ethan said. "I'm going to go listen." He went that night. He left Clara at the homestead. She argued about it briefly and without heat, accepting his reasoning when he gave it, which was that someone needed to be at the land, and she was the one who could read it in the dark. And he rode into Harlow alone and tied Cutter at the post outside the saloon and went in. The saloon in Harlow was the kind of place that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Low ceiling, rough tables, the smell of sawdust and cheap whiskey, and men who'd been working hard in the heat. Ethan ordered a beer he didn't intend to drink and found a position at the end of the bar where he could see the room. He spotted Cord in 10 minutes. Kerrigan's description was accurate. Big, dark, bearded, with the particular stillness of a man who was comfortable with the idea that other men might be afraid of him. He was sitting with two younger men who had the look of the Fitch brothers, lean, similar faces, talking too loud for men who were supposedly just relaxing. Ethan didn't approach them. He listened. It took patience. The better part of an hour, nursing a beer, watching the room, parsing the noise. But patience was something Ethan Walker had in quantities most men didn't, because patience was what you learned on a mountain when the weather turned, and there was nothing to do but wait and stay alive. He caught three things. The first was a name Pardee, used by Cord in reference to whoever had given the order for last night's work, not Bellows Pardee. The second was a location something referred to as the upper claim, said in the context of something that needed to be done before the first frost. The third was a number $400 mentioned as payment for something not yet completed. Ethan filed all three things away and left before Cord could notice he'd been watching. He rode home in the dark and arrived to find Clara awake at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the door unlocked, and he didn't say anything about that, but it settled something in him that he was grateful for. "Pardee," he said, sitting down. Clara looked at him. "That name mean anything to you?" She thought about it. Her eyes moved in the way they moved when she was reaching back through 14 months of careful observation and cataloging. "There was a man," she said slowly. "Last fall. He came to the property when I'd been here about 3 months. Rode up without invitation, said he was a surveyor, asked to cross the land to get to the upper pasture." She paused. "I told him no. He argued. I showed him the rifle." She looked at Ethan. He left, but not before he'd looked at the creek line from the road. He spent about 10 minutes just standing there looking at the water. "Did he give a name?" "He said Mitchell, but he had the look of a man who used names like other men used hats, put on whatever one was convenient." She leaned forward. "Pardee could be him. The same type anyway. Careful eyes, expensive boots for a surveyor." Ethan sat with that. "Bellows isn't the top of this," he said. "Bellows is the front of it. Someone is behind him with money enough to pay $400 for men to block a creek at night and send surveyors onto private land." He looked at Clara. "This is bigger than a banknote." "It always was," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You knew that," he said. "I suspected it." She looked at her hands on the table. "When I was working at Kerrigan's in those early months, I heard things, men talking. The way the trust had been buying land in the valley, the pattern of it, always the properties near water." She paused. "I didn't have the full picture, but I knew there was a picture." "Why didn't you tell me?" "You'd been home 5 days," she said. "You needed to find your footing before I started telling you the ground wasn't solid." He looked at her for a long moment. "Don't do that again," he said. She met his eyes. "Don't protect me from information," he said. "Whatever you know, whatever you suspect, I need to know it too. We're in this together, or we're in it worse." Something moved through her face. That complicated thing again, the one she kept pulling back from. "Together," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked down at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up. "There's something else," she said. "Something I've been waiting to tell you because I wasn't sure it was relevant. But now—" She paused. "In the records I kept. The deed documents, the payment receipts. When I went through the original land grant for this property, the one filed when your father took this land in 1869. She stopped. "There's a water rights declaration in that document, a formal one. Your father filed for senior water rights on the Walker Creek in 1869, and those rights were recorded by the Territorial Commissioner." She looked at him. "Not just the county recorder, Ethan, the Territorial Commissioner. That means those water rights exist at a level above anything Bellows or the Trust can touch with a county court ruling." The kitchen went very still. Ethan stared at her. "You have that document?" "I have a copy I made when I went through the original grant. The original is in the Territorial Records in Denver." She stood up and went to the cabinet beside the window, the one he'd never looked in because it was her cabinet, her space, the place she'd organized for herself in this house, and she came back to the table with a folded document that she laid in front of him. He opened it. She was right. His father's handwriting at the bottom, the territorial commissioner's seal, the date 1869, and a legal declaration of senior water rights on the Walker Creek system that superseded any subsequent claim by any party for any purpose. "This kills their case," he said. "This kills more than their case," she said. "If Bellows has been trying to acquire this land specifically for the water rights, and those water rights are senior and territorial and legally recorded, then everything he's done in this valley for 2 years has been in pursuit of something he never could have legally obtained. Not from you, not from any buyer." Ethan looked at the document. He knew about this, he said. He had to have known. A man like Bellows doesn't operate without doing his homework. He knew about the senior water rights. "Then why?" "Because he was going to bury it," Ethan said. "Get the land. Control the water as a matter of physical fact, regardless of what the law says. And by the time anyone thought to challenge the water rights, he'd have been drawing from that creek for years and established enough of a practical claim to make the legal fight expensive and long." He looked at Clara. This is how men like him operate. Not by being right, by making being right too costly for the other side. Clara looked at the document on the table between them. "We need to get this to Cross," she said. "First thing in the morning," he said. "And Cross needs to contact the Territorial Commissioner's office in Denver directly. Because this doesn't end in a county court. This ends at the territorial level, and it ends with Bellows and whoever is behind him answering for what they've been doing in this valley for 2 years. He looked at her. "You found this," he said. "It was in the records," she said. "I just read carefully." "You did more than that." He looked at the document, then at her. "You've been carrying this whole thing. Before I came back, while I was gone after I got here. You've been the one holding it together." She was quiet for a moment. "I had something worth holding together," she said. He looked at her and felt the truth of what he'd been feeling for the past week and a half, arranging itself into something he could almost name. Not yet. Not tonight, with a crisis still open and a document on the table that was about to change everything. But close. Getting closer every day. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow, this starts moving fast." She stood, and she picked up the document and put it carefully in the cabinet, and came back and looked at him standing by the table. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah?" "We're going to win this." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "We are." She went to bed, and he sat alone at the kitchen table for a while, with the lamp burning low, and he thought about a man who'd ridden up a mountain looking for silver, and found nothing, who'd nearly died in the cold and the dark, who'd come back to say goodbye to a piece of dirt. He thought about what that piece of dirt had turned out to be. He thought about Clara Whitmore reading his father's land grant by lamplight, alone in a house that wasn't hers, finding something she knew was important, and keeping it safe for a man she wasn't sure was ever coming home. He blew out the lamp. The dark was full and warm, and the summer night pressed close around the Walker homestead, and somewhere up in the high pasture, the creek was running the way it was supposed to run, and Ethan Walker went to bed feeling like a man with a fight in front of him. For the first time in 3 years, that felt like a good thing. Cross read the water rights document twice without saying a word. That was unusual for Gideon Cross, who had opinions about most things, and expressed them before he'd finished looking at them. The fact that he read it twice in silence told Ethan everything he needed to know about what they were holding. 1869, Cross said finally. "My father filed it the year he took the land. Thomas Walker was a careful man." Cross set the document down and looked at Ethan. "This is a senior appropriation declaration filed with the Territorial Commissioner under the 1867 Water Code. It predates every subsequent claim on that creek system by at least 6 years. He paused. "Ethan, this doesn't just win your case. This unwinds everything Bellows has been building in this valley for 2 years. I know. If he's been acquiring downstream properties on the basis that he could eventually control the Walker Creek headwaters. Every one of those acquisitions was built on a false premise, Ethan said. He was selling people a future he couldn't legally deliver. Cross leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, doing the kind of calculation that required looking at something that wasn't there. I need to contact the Territorial Commissioner's office directly, he said. Today. Not tomorrow, today, because once Bellows knows you have this document, and he will know possibly before nightfall, he'll move to bury it, Ethan said, or challenge its validity, or find some reason to question the authenticity of your copy. Cross looked at him. We need the original on record in Denver confirmed before he has time to respond. Can you do that today? I can send a telegram to the commissioner's office this morning and have a clerk confirm the filing within 24 hours. He stood up. Go home. Let me work. And Ethan? He stopped him at the door. Don't tell anyone else about this document yet. Not Kerrigan. Not anyone. The fewer people who know before Denver confirms, the less opportunity Bellows has to interfere. Ethan rode home with that instruction sitting on him like a stone. The not telling was the hard part. Kerrigan had put his trust in them. The other ranchers in the valley were watching and waiting, and Clara had found the document in the first place, had kept it safe for months without knowing the full weight of what she was holding, and she deserved to know what Cross had said. He told her. She listened at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee and her eyes on his face, and when he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. 24 hours, she said. Maybe less if the commissioner's office responds fast. And in the meantime, we act like nothing has changed. He looked at her. Which means the regular work, the cattle, the creek watch, everything normal. She looked at him for a moment. Can you do that act normal when something this big is sitting in a telegram line to Denver? I've spent 2 years acting normal while everything was wrong, he said. I reckon I can manage one day. Something moved through her expression, something that recognized what that sentence contained and chose not to push on it. I'll check the upper creek, she said. You take the south fence. Bellows' men reblocked that channel once. They'll try again. She was right. She was right about most practical things he'd come to understand in the 3 weeks since he'd ridden home. The way she read the land, the way she anticipated what needed doing before it announced itself, it was the product of 14 months of necessity, of being alone out here, and having no one to defer to and no margin for being wrong. She'd developed a kind of competence that was almost uncomfortable to witness, because it reminded him of how much had gone on here without him. He took the south fence. She took the creek. He was re-stringing wire on the third post when he heard it. A horse coming fast up the road from Harlow. Too fast for a social visit. He turned and recognized the rider, Billy Price, one of Cross's young clerks, 16 years old, and riding like the horse was on fire. Ethan set down the wire and walked toward the road. Billy pulled up and was off his horse before it fully stopped. Mr. Walker, Mr. Cross sent me. He said to come fast and not to stop for anything. What happened? Bellows filed an emergency injunction with Judge Harker this morning. Billy was breathing hard. Not the circuit court, he went directly to Harker in Fort Collins. He's asking for a temporary restraining order against any transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the Walker property pending resolution of the trust's claims. Billy swallowed. Mr. Cross says if Harker grants it, you can't do anything with the land or the water while the injunction is in place. And the injunction could last months, Ethan said. Mr. Cross said possibly through the winter. Ethan stood with that for exactly 3 seconds. How did Bellows know to file this morning? He said. We only went to Cross last night. Billy looked uncomfortable. Mr. Cross is asking that same question, sir. Someone had talked, or someone had been watching, or both. Go back and tell Cross I'm coming, Ethan said. And tell him I need to know who Harker is and how fast he moves on emergency filings. Billy was back on his horse and gone before the dust from his arrival had settled. Ethan walked to the barn-saddled cutter and was halfway down the lane when Clara came down from the upper pasture at a trot, reading his urgency the way she read everything immediately accurately without being told. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. She'd stopped asking those. He told her while he rode, and she kept pace beside him. Her jaw tightened when he got to Harker. "Harker is Bellows's judge," she said. Cross said as much. Then getting to Harker first was always part of the plan. The fraud filing, the creek blockage, the water diversion, none of that was meant to win. It was all meant to create enough chaos to justify an emergency injunction. She looked at him. "Ethan, if that injunction goes through, we can't send the water rights document to Denver. We can't do anything with the property. We're frozen." Cross already sent the telegram. She looked at him sharply. "This morning before Bellows filed," he said. "It might be enough." "Might be." "I know." They rode into Harlow fast and found Cross at the telegraph office, which was where he'd been since 7 in the morning. By the look of him, coat-off sleeves rolled the expression of a man in the middle of something that required all of him. He looked up when Ethan came through the door. "Denver responded," he said. Ethan stopped. "The Territorial Commissioner's office confirmed the 1869 filing at 10:47 this morning." Cross held up a telegram. "Senior Appropriation Declaration, Walker Creek System recorded and confirmed in the Territorial Record. Official." He looked at Ethan. "Bellows filed with Harker at 11:15. 28 minutes. "We got there first," Clara said. "By 28 minutes, Cross said. "Yes." He sat down, which was something Ethan had never seen him do in the middle of a conversation. It was the kind of sitting down that happens when a man has been standing on something thin for a long time and has just found solid ground. The injunction Bellows filed is a county-level instrument. It applies to county-recorded property rights. But the water rights on the Walker Creek are now confirmed as a territorial record. They exist above the jurisdiction of Harker's court. He looked at Ethan. "Harker can freeze the land all he wants. He cannot freeze the water rights. And without the water rights, the land Bellows wants is worth exactly what any other cattle ranch is worth, which is less than half of what the trust has spent trying to acquire it." The telegraph office was quiet. Ethan let himself feel it, the release of it, the way a knot comes undone when the right tension is applied in the right place. "It's not over," Cross said. "The injunction still needs to be fought. The fraud allegation against Mrs. Whitmore still needs to be addressed. And the trust will not simply withdraw because the water rights are confirmed. They'll look for another angle." He paused. "But we have the high ground now, which is considerably better than where we were yesterday." Clara put her hands flat on the counter and looked at Cross. "What do we need to do next?" Cross looked at her for a moment. He'd been looking at her differently since she'd produced the water rights document, with the particular respect that old men who've spent their lives dealing with incompetence reserve for competence when they finally encounter it. "We need to get Judge Morrison involved," he said. "The circuit judge. He comes through in October, but given the territorial confirmation, I believe I can make a case for an emergency session. A legitimate emergency this time, not the manufactured kind that Bellows used to get to Harker." He looked at both of them. "And I need depositions. Every rancher in this valley who has had dealings with Bellows or the trust in the past 2 years. Kerrigan, Alderbeck, Stout, and anyone else you can bring me." "I'll ride out today," Ethan said. "There's one more thing." Cross's voice changed, got quieter, more careful. "The name Pardee, the one you heard at the saloon." Ethan looked at him. "You know that name. I did some asking this morning quietly. Edmund Pardee is a land speculator out of Kansas City. He's been operating in Colorado and New Mexico territories for the past 4 years, acquiring water-adjacent properties through intermediaries and then selling consolidated water access to railroad and mining companies." Cross looked at Ethan steadily. "He's not a small man, Ethan. He has money and lawyers and connections in Denver. He's the one behind Bellows. He's the one who's been funding this. Can he be held accountable? If we can tie him to the creek blockage, to the fraudulent legal filings, to any illegal activity in this county? Yes. But that's a harder case to build." Cross paused. "It can be built, but it takes time. And it takes evidence, and it takes someone willing to testify against him." "Cord," Ethan said. Cross looked at him. "The man at the saloon. He works for Pardee through Bellows. He built that barrier on the creek. Ethan thought about the conversation he'd heard, the $400, the upper claim, the things not yet completed. He's been paid for work that hasn't finished yet, which means he still needs that money, which means he's still reachable. Cross was quiet for a moment. Reaching him is one thing, he said. Reaching him without it going sideways is another. I know the difference, Ethan said. He found Cord the next afternoon. Not at the saloon this time. He found him at the livery at the edge of Harlow, working on his saddle with the methodical focus of a man who had nothing pressing to do. The Fitch brothers were not with him. That was either luck or opportunity, and Ethan decided to treat it as opportunity. He walked in and sat down on a hay bale 10 feet from Cord and waited. Cord looked up, looked at him again in the way a man looks when he's trying to place a face and doesn't like that he can't. Help you, Cord said. Probably, Ethan said. My name is Ethan Walker. This is my town, and that's my land you helped block up last week. Cord went very still. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. $400, Ethan said. Half now, half when it's done. Upper claim, Pardee. He looked at Cord with the particular patience of a man who has been cold on a mountain for 2 years and has learned that waiting costs nothing. I was at the saloon 3 nights ago. I hear well. The stillness in Cord was the stillness of a man running calculations. What do you want? Cord said finally. I want to know what else Pardee has hired you for, Ethan said. Not the creek. What else? What's the thing that isn't done yet that the other half of $400 is paying for? Cord looked at him. And if I tell you that, he said, what do I get? You get to not be the man who goes to jail for Edmund Pardee when this falls apart, Ethan said. Which it's going to. Today, tomorrow, next week, the timing is the only thing that's not settled. The outcome is. He held Cord's gaze. Men like Pardee don't protect the men who worked for them when the law comes around. They protect themselves. You know that. Something moved through Cord's face that was almost relief. The particular relief of a man who'd been waiting for a reason to get off a bad road and had just been handed one. He talked. What he said made Ethan Walker very cold and very still in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. The second job, the one that wasn't finished yet, wasn't about the creek. It was about Hutchins. Edgar Hutchins, the county recorder, who had accepted Clara's payment, who had signed the statement for Cross, who was the single most important witness in the legal case against the trust. Pardee wanted Hutchins discredited, not threatened. Pardee was too careful for direct threats. Discredited. There was a forged document in preparation. Cord said something that would suggest Hutchins had taken payment from Clara Whitmore personally, not as the county recorder, but as an individual, which would transform his acceptance of the note payment from a legal act into a corrupt one. If that document surfaced before Morrison's hearing, Hutchins' testimony was worthless. Their entire case rested on Hutchins, and Pardee had found the lever. Where is the document now? Ethan said. Aldridge has it. Cord said the lawyer's name the way you say the name of something you don't want to touch. He's been sitting on it waiting for the right moment. My job was going to be delivering it to the court clerk. He paused. I haven't done it yet. And you're not going to, Ethan said. Cord looked at him. What do you want me to do instead? I want you to write down everything you just told me, Ethan said. Right now, in your own hand, and I want you to sign it. Cord hesitated. You said men like Pardee don't protect the men who worked for them, Ethan said. You're right, but there's another side to that. Men who come forward with evidence before the law comes to them, they're in a different position than men who get caught. He looked at Cord steadily. You made a choice when you built that barrier. You can make a different choice right now. Cord looked at the saddle in his hands for a long moment. Then he set it down. Give me paper, he said. Ethan rode to Cross, with Cord's statement in his coat, and Cord himself riding behind him, which was not something he'd planned, but which Cross had always said was better than paper alone. Cross read the statement standing up. Aldridge, he said. The forged document is with him now, Ethan said. If we move today. I know a deputy marshal who will move today, Cross said. Commissioner Hayes out of Fort Collins. He doesn't work for Harker, and he doesn't take money from the trust. He looked at Ethan. If we can get to Aldridge's office before that document leaves it, then we have forgery on top of everything else, Ethan said. And forgery committed in the context of a court proceeding is federal, which is exactly what Morrison needs to pull this case up to the circuit level and out of Harker's hands entirely. He went to find Hutchins while Cross sent for Marshal Hayes. He found him at the recorder's office, still at his desk, still precise and careful, and unaware that his name had been at the center of a plan that was sitting in a lawyer's satchel across town. When Ethan told him, Hutchins sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, I want to be present when they find it. That's not the safest. I want to be present, Hutchins said again, and his voice had the quality of a man who has spent his life doing things carefully and correctly, and has just been told that someone tried to use his integrity as a weapon against him. This is my name. I want to look at what they made in my name. Ethan looked at him. All right, he said. Marshal Hayes arrived in Harlow by mid-afternoon, a lean, deliberate man with a federal badge and the kind of economy of movement that came from not wasting effort on anything that wasn't necessary. Cross briefed him in 10 minutes. Hayes asked 4 questions, all of them precise. Then he put on his hat. Let's go, he said. Aldridge's office was above the feed store on Harlow's main street, which meant that when Hayes and Ethan and Hutchins went up the stairs, the whole of Harlow's main street had a view of it. Ethan wasn't sure if that was useful or not, and decided it didn't matter. Hayes knocked once. Aldridge opened the door with the expression of a man who had been expecting a different kind of Tuesday. Hayes presented his federal credentials and a written authorization that Cross had prepared, and said in the flat and definitive voice of a man who didn't negotiate about these things, Mr. Aldridge, I have reason to believe that a forged document related to ongoing court proceedings is present in this office. I need to search the premises. Aldridge looked at the badge, looked at Hayes, looked past Hayes at Ethan Walker standing on the landing. Something went out of his face. I need to contact my... You can contact whoever you need to contact after I've conducted the search, Hayes said, and he walked in. They found the document in the 3rd place. Hayes looked in a leather portfolio in the bottom drawer of the desk, the same portfolio Aldridge had been carrying when he'd ridden out to the Walker homestead with Bellows 3 weeks ago. It was a single page, printed to look like a county record, bearing Hutchins's name and seal, a seal that was good enough to fool someone who hadn't seen the real one daily for years. Hutchins looked at it for a long time. The seal is wrong, he said quietly. The inner ring spacing is off by a fraction. He looked at Hayes. But it would pass casual inspection. It doesn't need to pass your inspection, Hayes said. It needs to pass a court clerk's inspection. He put the document in his coat. Mr. Aldridge, I'm placing you under arrest for the fabrication of a false court document in violation of federal territory statutes. Aldridge said something about lawyers and rights and the trust, and Ethan stopped listening because across the room through Aldridge's window he could see the main street of Harlow below, and standing on the boardwalk across the street watching the stairs was Roy Bellows. Their eyes met through the glass. Bellows understood in that moment what was happening. Ethan could see it move through him, the understanding, and behind it the calculation, the rapid reassessment that men like Bellows did, automatically looking for the next position to retreat to. Then Bellows turned and walked away down the street. Ethan watched him go. He didn't follow him. Not today. Today had enough in it already. Then he came down the stairs and walked across the street to where Clara was standing. She'd ridden in an hour after him, reading the situation from a distance the way she always did, knowing when to stay back and when to appear. And she looked at him with the question in her eyes. Aldridge is in federal custody, he said. The forged document is with Hayes. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Bellows, she said, still free, for now. He looked down the street where Bellows had disappeared. Cross is going to use the forgery to demand the case go to Morrison. Federal involvement in a county preceding territorial water rights, a documented pattern of fraudulent legal tactics. Morrison will take it. When? Cross thinks he can get Morrison here within the week. Clara looked at him. 1 more week, she said. 1 more week, he said. She nodded. She looked down the street toward where Bellows had gone, and then she looked back at Ethan, and something was settling in her face. Not relaxation exactly, because the fight wasn't finished, but the specific quality of calm that comes to people who have been holding something very heavy for a very long time and have just been told they can set it down soon. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. When I came out here, when I first started working this land, she paused. There were 3 weeks in that first autumn when I almost left. The work was harder than I'd anticipated, and I was alone, and I didn't know if you were alive, and I didn't know if any of it meant anything. She looked at him steadily. I stayed because of the letter. The one you wrote to me, he said. Yes. She met his eyes. I wrote down every reason I was staying, every reason it was worth it, and I read it back to myself on the mornings when I didn't want to get up. And one of the reasons was... She stopped, started again. I wrote that someone had once decided I was worth saving when I had nothing to offer in return, and I wanted to be someone who did the same. She paused. That's why I stayed. Ethan looked at her for a long moment in the middle of Harlow's main street with the afternoon sun hard and the dust settling from the marshal's arrival and the whole complicated, expensive, exhausting, clarifying 3 weeks behind them like a road that had been worth walking. Clara, he said. I know, she said quickly. You don't need to. I want to, he said. She stopped. I came back here to say goodbye, he said. I've said that enough times that it's starting to sound like the wrong thing to have planned. He looked at her. I don't want to say goodbye to any of it. Not the land, not the creek, not the kitchen table or the columbines in the jar, or the way you know which fence post needs attention before it tells you. He paused. And not you. She looked at him. That's a lot to say on a main street, she said, but her voice was quiet, and something in it was different from its usual careful evenness. I know. He looked at her. I figure I've been quiet about it long enough. Something moved through her face through all of it, not just the edges this time, and it was the thing she'd been pulling back from for 3 weeks, and she didn't pull back from it now. 1 more week, she said again, but differently this time. 1 more week, he agreed. They rode home together in the late afternoon, and the homestead came into view with its smoke and its green pasture and its straight fence line, and Ethan Walker rode toward it with a woman beside him, and a fight almost won, and something alive in his chest that had been dead for 3 years. And he thought about how far a man could fall and still find his way back to something worth having. He thought about kindness given without expectation of return. He thought about a woman who had stayed when she could have left, who had held on when holding on cost something, who had found in a dead man's land, grant a document that changed everything, because she had been paying attention when no one asked her to. The cattle moved in the pen. The creek ran in the high pasture the way it was supposed to run. The evening settled over the Colorado mountains, the way evenings do, unhurried, enormous, indifferent to the smallness of human trouble and the largeness of human hope. And the Walker homestead held all of it, the way a home holds things, the way a good piece of land holds what's been put into it and gives it back, changed and better. Ethan unsaddled Cutter and led him into the barn. Clara unsaddled Bess and put her in the next stall. They worked side by side in the way they'd come to work without needing to choreograph it, without getting in each other's way, each knowing what the other was going to do next and moving around it naturally. Like 2 people who had been doing this together for longer than 3 weeks, like 2 people who intended to keep doing it for considerably longer than that. Supper, she said when the horses were settled. Yes, ma'am, he said. She looked at him at the ma'am, looked at him with the almost smile that had been getting less almost every day, and she walked out of the barn toward the house. He followed her. The door closed behind them both. Judge Morrison arrived on a Wednesday. Ethan knew he was coming before he saw him because Cross had sent Billy Price out to the homestead at dawn with a note that said simply, Morrison confirmed. Circuit Court session, Friday. Be ready. 2 words at the end that Cross had underlined twice, which was not something the old man did lightly. Be ready. Ethan read the note at the kitchen table while Clara stood at the stove, and the morning was still gray outside the window, and he set it down and looked at it for a moment. Friday, he said. Clara turned. She looked at the note without picking it up the way she'd learned to read things from a distance when she wasn't sure she wanted them closer. 2 days, she said. 2 days. She turned back to the stove. He watched her shoulders settle, not tense exactly, but gathering. The way a person gathers themselves when they've been waiting a long time for something, and it's finally within reach, and the last stretch of waiting is the hardest. I'll need to press my dress, she said. He almost smiled. Not because it was small, it wasn't small. It was the most practical thing she could have said, and practical was how Clara Whitmore had survived everything that had happened to her, and he respected it entirely. I'll need to find a clean shirt, he said. She looked over her shoulder at him. There are 2 in the chest in your room, she said. I washed them last week. He looked at her. She looked back at the stove. He drank his coffee and thought about a woman who had somewhere in the last month started washing his shirts without mentioning it, and about the particular weight of being cared for by someone who did it without making a ceremony of it, without asking for acknowledgement, without needing to be thanked. Just doing it. Because it was there to be done, and she was there to do it. He thought about that for a long time after she'd gone out to the morning chores. The 2 days before Friday were the longest he'd spent in recent memory, which was saying something given the last 2 years of his life. They worked. They did the regular work, cattle fencing, the garden, the creek check, and they went to see Cross on Thursday to go over what would happen in the courtroom, and Cross walked them through it with the thoroughness of a man who believed that preparation was its own form of prayer. Morrison's session would address 3 things: the validity of Clara's payment and the status of the Walker title, the fraud allegation against Clara, and most significantly, the federal dimension introduced by Aldridge's arrest and the forged document. Cross had prepared for all 3. He had Hutchins's statements. He had the territorial water rights confirmation from Denver. He had Cord's signed testimony. He had depositions from Kerrigan, Alderbeck, and Stout, all of whom had agreed, each in their own particular way, to put their names to what they knew about Bellows and the Trust's operations in the valley. What about Pardee? Ethan asked. Cross leaned back. Pardee is a harder problem. He's in Kansas City. Hayes has sent documentation to the federal marshal's office there, but whether they act and how fast... He paused. We may not have Pardee in a courtroom Friday. What we will have is enough evidence to establish that he was directing the operation here, which creates a federal record against him whether he's physically present or not. And Bellows. Bellows is in Harlow, Cross said. I've confirmed that. He hasn't run, which tells me either he thinks he can still fight this, or he's waiting to see which way it falls before he decides to run. He looked at Ethan. He will be in that courtroom Friday. Ethan thought about Bellows on the boardwalk below Aldridge's window, watching up through the glass. The way the understanding had moved through him. The way he'd turned and walked away with the deliberateness of a man repositioning rather than retreating. Good, Ethan said. Clara had been quiet through most of Cross's briefing. She'd listened with the focused stillness she brought to things that mattered, and she'd asked 2 questions, both of them precise, both of them about the fraud allegation, specifically because that was the piece that was personal, in a way nothing else was. A fraudulent land maneuver was a legal problem. A fraud allegation against her name was something else. On the walk back to their horses, she said, if Morrison rules the payment valid, the fraud allegation goes away automatically. Yes, Ethan said. And if he rules the payment invalid, he won't. Ethan. Clara. He stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned and looked at him in the afternoon light, with the same steadiness she'd been looking at him with since the day he'd ridden up to his own house, and she'd put her hand on a rifle to protect it. Morrison is going to look at a county recorder who accepted that payment in good faith and has signed 2 statements confirming it. He's going to look at a territorial water rights declaration that predates every claim the trust has made in this valley. He's going to look at a forged document produced by the trust's own lawyer and an arrest made by a federal marshal. He held her gaze. He is going to look at all of that, and then he is going to look at you, and he is going to see exactly what you are. She was quiet for a moment. "What am I?" she said. He looked at her. "The person who kept this whole thing from falling apart," he said. She held his gaze for a long time. Then she looked away, and he saw her jaw work once, and she breathed, and when she looked back, the steadiness was back in full. But something underneath it was different, softer, or maybe just more honest. "Let's go home," she said. Friday came the way important days always come, exactly like any other morning, unreasonably ordinary, with the cattle needing water, and the stove needing wood, and the world declining to acknowledge that something significant was about to happen in it. They rode into Harlow side by side. The courtroom was the largest room in the county building, which in a town the size of Harlow meant it held about 40 people comfortably, and about 60 if nobody minded being close. By the time Ethan and Clara arrived with Cross, it held closer to 70. Kerrigan was there with Mary beside him. Both of them settled into seats near the front, with the look of people who had been waiting for this particular day for a long time. Alderbeck was there, and Stout, and a half-dozen other ranchers and townspeople whose faces Ethan recognized from the years before he'd left, and who looked at him now with the particular warmth of people welcoming back someone they'd given up on. Hutchins was there, sitting straight-backed near the front, his hands folded on his knees, his county recorders bearing intact and undented by what the last several weeks had put him through. Bellows was there. He was sitting near the back on the trust side of the room with 2 men Ethan didn't recognize. Denver men, by the look of them lawyers brought in after Aldridge's arrest. He was dressed carefully, as he always was, and he looked at Ethan when Ethan walked in with the expression of a man who has decided that showing nothing is the same as having nothing to show. Their eyes met. Neither of them looked away first. They just looked at each other across the room, across 3 weeks of legal filings and blocked creeks and forged documents and everything that had been built and broken between them. And then Ethan walked to the front and sat down beside Cross and didn't look at Bellows again. Judge Morrison came in at 9 o'clock. He was younger than Ethan had expected, maybe 50, with a trimmed beard going gray, and the kind of face that had seen enough of human nature to have developed opinions about it. He moved through the room with the unhurried authority of a man who was comfortable with the power he'd been given, because he took it seriously rather than personally. He called the session to order, and then he did something Ethan hadn't expected. He looked at the room, not at the lawyers, not at the documents on the bench in front of him. At the room. At the ranchers and townspeople filling the seats at Hutchins with his folded hands, at Clara sitting beside Ethan, with her pressed dress, and her steady eyes at Bellows in the back with his Denver lawyers. "I've reviewed the filings in this matter," Morrison said. "All of them, the original default notice, the payment documentation, the territorial water rights confirmation, the federal arrest record." He paused. "I've also reviewed an interesting document that I was not expecting to encounter, a forged county record bearing Mr. Hutchins' seal recovered from the offices of Mr. Aldridge, who is currently in federal custody." He looked at the Denver lawyers near the back. "I want it to be very clear before we begin that the court's awareness of that document will be informing everything that happens in this room today." One of the Denver lawyers started to stand. Morrison looked at him. The lawyer sat back down. Cross presented their case in the order he'd planned it, and he did it with the economy and precision of someone who had spent 30 years knowing exactly which words mattered and which ones were furniture. The payment, the receipt. Hutchins' testimony delivered in person, with the specificity of a man who had been keeping careful records his entire career and was grateful for the opportunity to present them. The territorial water rights declaration confirmed by Denver, predating every trust claim in the valley by 16 years. Then Cord's testimony. That was the moment the room changed. Cord was not a sympathetic figure. He was a large man with a rough history who had built an illegal barrier on someone else's land for money, and he said so plainly when Morrison asked him to describe his involvement. He didn't dress it up. He said what he'd done and why and who had paid him, and what else he'd been asked to do that he hadn't done yet. He said Edmund Party's name in a room full of people who had never heard it, and he said Roy Bellows's name beside it, and he explained the relationship between them in terms simple enough that nobody in the room could misunderstand it. Ethan watched the room while Cord talked. He watched Kerrigan's face go from tight to satisfied. He watched Hutchins's folded hands grip each other briefly and then relax. He watched the Denver lawyers exchange a look that was the look of men deciding how much of a ship to try to save. He watched Bellows. Bellows did not move, did not react, did not shift in his seat or change his expression or give any outward sign that what Cord was saying had any connection to him. He sat with the stillness of a man who had decided that the only move left was to be unreadable, and he held it with a discipline that Ethan in a different life might have respected. When Cord finished, Morrison made a note. Then he looked at the Denver lawyers. Does the trust wish to address the testimony just given? The senior lawyer, a man named Fitch, no relation to the brothers, just the same. Common name stood and said carefully that the trust wished to note that Mr. Cord's testimony was that of a self-admitted criminal seeking favorable treatment, and that the trust did not concede any of the facts he'd presented regarding the trust's operations in Larimer County. Morrison looked at him for a moment. "That's noted," he said in a tone that made clear it wasn't particularly helpful. Then he looked at Bellows directly. "Mr. Bellows," he said, "you filed the original default notice on the Walker property in April of 1884. Is that correct?" Bellows stood. "That is correct, Your Honor." "At the time you filed that notice, did you have evidence that Ethan Walker was deceased?" "We had a reasonable basis to believe." "Did you have evidence," Morrison said, "that Ethan Walker was deceased?" A pause. "No direct evidence," Bellows said. "He had been absent for 5 months following an—" "Thank you," Morrison said. "You may sit down." Bellows sat. The Denver lawyers exchanged another look. Morrison looked at his documents for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I'd like to ask you directly about the payment you made in September of 1884. Clara stood. She stood the way she did everything without hesitation, without performance, straight and clear and present. "Yes, Your Honor." "Why did you make it?" The room was very quiet. Clara looked at Morrison steadily. "Because the land belonged to Ethan Walker," she said. "And Ethan Walker had done something for me once without knowing who I was or expecting anything back. And when I saw his land about to be taken by people who had no right to it—" She paused. "I had the means to prevent it, so I did." Morrison looked at her for a moment. "Did you make this payment with the intention of establishing any personal claim on the Walker property?" "No, Your Honor." "Did you receive any compensation, direct or indirect, for making this payment?" "No, Your Honor." "Did you make any false representations to the county recorder when you made this payment?" "No, Your Honor." She held his gaze. "Mr. Hutchins can speak to everything I said and everything I showed him. He kept records of the entire transaction. There is nothing in that record that is anything other than what it appears to be." Morrison looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at his notes. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "You may sit." She sat down beside Ethan, and her hand just for a moment found the edge of the table beside his, and their fingers were very close without quite touching. And then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at Morrison and waited. Morrison wrote something. He wrote for what felt like a long time. Then he set down his pen and looked at the room. The payment made by Clara Whitmore in September of 1884 on the Walker property note was made in good faith, accepted in good faith by the county recorder, and constitutes valid satisfaction of the outstanding debt. He said it plainly, without ornamentation. The title to the Walker property is clear. The fraud allegation against Mrs. Whitmore is without foundation and is dismissed. The room exhaled. Ethan felt it move through him. Not triumph, exactly, something quieter than that. Something more like the moment a wound finally closes. But Morrison wasn't finished. "Regarding the Cattlemen's Trust's conduct in this matter," he continued, and his voice had changed in a way that made the Denver lawyers both go still. The court finds that the trust's legal actions in this proceeding, including but not limited to the filing of the emergency injunction with a county court following the filing of a counterclaim of which the trust had advance knowledge, and the preparation of a forged document by the trust's legal representative, constitute a pattern of conduct that exceeds aggressive legal strategy and enters the territory of fraud upon this court. He looked at the Denver lawyers. I am referring this matter to the Federal District Court, with a recommendation for investigation of the trust's activities in Larimer County and Larimer County's water rights system over the preceding 2 years. He paused. I am also issuing a personal subpoena for the appearance of Edmund Pardee of Kansas City before this court at the earliest available date. The room went very quiet. Then it went very loud. Ethan heard Kerrigan say something behind him, a single short word, emphatic, and heard the response from the ranchers around him, the sound of people who had been squeezed for a long time and had just watched the pressure release. He heard the Denver lawyers begin talking to each other in urgent low voices. He heard Bellows's chair scrape back. He turned. Bellows was standing. He was looking at Morrison, and then he looked at Ethan, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, something showed in his face, not fear, not regret, something colder than both. The look of a man who has played a long game and lost it, and is already calculating the next one. He picked up his hat. He walked toward the door. Marshal Hayes was standing at the door. Hayes held up one hand. "Mr. Bellows," he said, "I have a federal warrant for your detention pending the district court's investigation." Bellows stopped. He looked at Hayes, looked at the warrant, looked at the room full of ranchers and townspeople who had been his valley for 2 years and were not his anymore. He put his hat on. "I'll need to speak with my lawyers," he said. "Of course," Hayes said pleasantly, and stepped aside just enough to let Bellows's lawyers through first. The doors closed behind them. Ethan turned back to the front of the room. Cross was beside him gathering papers with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had expected this outcome but hadn't assumed it, which was the only honest way to expect anything. He looked at Ethan over the papers. "Well," he said. "Well," Ethan said. "It's done," Cross said. Ethan looked at Clara. She was looking at her hands in her lap, and she was doing the thing she did when something hit her harder than she'd prepared for, holding herself very still, breathing carefully, not letting it all arrive at once. He'd seen her do it twice before. The morning she'd read the fraud allegation. The afternoon she'd found the water rights document in the land grant and understood what it meant. He didn't say anything. He just waited. After a moment, she looked up. Her eyes were bright. Not spilling over Clara Whitmore did not spill over in courtrooms, or probably anywhere but bright with something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had just been given room to exist. "It's done," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at him, and this time she let the smile come all the way. It changed her whole face. He'd known it would. He'd been watching it almost happen for a month, and he'd known that when it came fully, it would be something, and it was the kind of smile that a person arrives at after a long road, that means more because of what it cost, that carries the weight of everything that came before it, and is still somehow light. "Don't call me ma'am," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said again. She laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of her, real the way only things that surprise you are real. And it was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and it was better than he'd expected, which was saying something because he'd expected it to be considerable. Kerrigan appeared at his shoulder and put a hand on it, a heavy hand, the kind that meant something, and said, "Walker, good work," and then moved on because Kerrigan was not a man who lingered over sentiment when there was perfectly good celebrating to be done. The courtroom cleared in the way that courtrooms clear after something important, slowly, with people stopping to talk to, shake hands to say things they'd been waiting to say. Hutchins came to find them and shook Clara's hand with both of his and said, "I am very glad you stayed." And Clara said, "So am I," and meant all of it. Cross waited until most of the room had emptied and then said, "There will be follow-on proceedings. The federal investigation into the trust, Pardee's subpoena. It won't be entirely quiet for a while." He looked at both of them. "But the land is yours. The water rights are confirmed. And nobody in this county or any adjacent county is going to be able to touch either one of those things without going through a wall of federal documentation that would take years to dismantle." He picked up his hat. "Go home." They went home. They rode the 7 miles from Harlow to the Walker homestead in the early afternoon, and the Colorado summer was at its fullest around them. The sky enormous and blue. The grasses tall. The smell of the mountains coming down on the breeze, the way it did in the afternoons, when the air moved from the high country into the valley. Ethan had lived his whole life in this landscape and loved it the way you love things that have always been there, the way you love things you can't imagine being without. He rode beside Clara and felt the truth of what was happening settle into him fully for the first time. He was home, not just on the land, not just in the house. He was home the way a person is home when they have something to come back to and someone to come back to it with. And those two things are the same person, and that person chose to be there. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He'd been working up to this for a month. He was done working up to it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to ask it plainly because I'm not a man who's good at asking things sideways." She held his gaze. "Then ask it plainly." "Stay," he said. "Not because the land needs tending. Not because of the debt or the work or any of the reasons that brought you here. Those are done. Morrison settled all of them today, and you don't owe me anything, and you never did." He looked at her steadily. "Stay because I want you here. Because this place is better with you in it, and I'm better with you beside me. Because I haven't wanted to say goodbye to a single morning since I came home, and I don't intend to start." He paused. "Stay because I'm asking you to." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The horses moved beneath them, and the afternoon was wide and warm, and the homestead was coming into view around the last bend with its smoke and its green pasture and its straight fence lines and the columbines growing along the south wall that she had planted without anyone asking her to. "Ethan Walker," she said. "Yes, I have been staying," she said. "I stayed for 14 months before you came home. I stayed through 3 weeks of bank lawyers and forged documents and blocked creeks." She looked at him. "I wasn't planning to stop." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I wanted to ask anyway." Something moved through her face through all of it fully, and without reservation, the way things move through a person when they stop holding them back. "All right," she said. "You've asked, and I've answered." She looked ahead at the homestead. "Now let's go home." They rode in together. He unsaddled Cutter and she unsaddled Bess, and they worked side by side in the barn, in the way they'd come to work, without wasted motion, without needing to narrate it. Two people who had learned each other's rhythms and moved inside them comfortably. When the horses were settled, he walked out of the barn, and she walked beside him, and he stopped at the edge of the pasture and looked at the land. All of it. The north fence with its new posts. The garden beside the house with its neat rows. The creek running down from the high pasture, the way it was supposed to run. The mountains behind all of it, enormous and indifferent and permanently beautiful. The same mountains that had nearly killed him 2 years ago, and that he had come back down from, because surviving was what his body did, and that he understood now had sent him home for a reason. He looked at Clara, standing beside him. She was looking at the land the way she always looked at it, with the particular attention of someone who sees what needs doing, and what's been done, and what the difference between those two things means in terms of real work on real ground. But there was something else in it today. Something that wasn't assessment. Something that was maybe for the first time simply being somewhere and finding it enough. "It's a good piece of land," she said. "It is," he said. "Your father knew what he was doing when he filed those water rights. He knew what he was doing with most things." She was quiet for a moment. "What was he like?" "Careful," Ethan said. "Honest. Not a man who said more than he meant, which meant when he said something, you could take it to the bank." He paused. "He would have liked you." Clara looked at him. Why? Because you read his land grant, Ethan said, and you understood what was in it, and you kept it safe. He looked at her. He spent his life building something and trying to make sure it lasted. He would have liked knowing that someone cared enough to read what he'd written. Clara held his gaze. I care, she said simply. I know, he said. That's the thing about you, Clara. You care about things the right way, not loudly, not with a lot of words around it. You just take care of what's in front of you, and you do it well, and you don't stop when it gets hard. He looked at her. I want to spend a long time watching you do that. She looked at him for a moment. You're getting better at saying things sideways, she said. I'm working on it, he said. She stepped toward him. Just one step, deliberate and unhesitating, the way she did everything, and she put her hand against his chest, the way you put your hand against something to feel. Whether it's solid, it was solid. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that, at the edge of the Walker pasture in the Colorado summer afternoon, with the land around them and the mountains behind them, and 14 months of history, and 3 weeks of fighting, and a lifetime of possibility arranged ahead of them. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left that needed saying. Not right now. Right now was enough. Now was... The autumn came, the way autumn comes in the Colorado mountains. First in the mornings, cool and sharp, then working its way into the afternoons. And then one day you wake up and it's simply there, settled in the aspens, gone gold, and the air carrying something that smells like the end of one thing and the beginning of another. On the first Saturday of October, Ethan Walker and Clara Whitmore were married in the yard of the Walker homestead with Cross as witness, and Kerrigan and Mary standing in the dry grass, and Hutchins there with his careful hands folded, and a look on his face that was the look of a man who had done one right thing in a critical moment, and watched it grow into something larger than he'd imagined. It was not a large ceremony. It was not a long one. What it was real. Afterward, Mary Kerrigan produced a cake from somewhere, which was the kind of thing Mary Kerrigan did, and Tom shook Ethan's hand for the second time with both of his and said, "Good work, Walker," which was exactly what he'd said in the courtroom, and which meant the same thing and more. Ethan looked at Clara beside him in a dress that was nicer than her work dress and that she'd produced from somewhere without explanation, with her hair down for once loose and dark in the autumn light, laughing at something Mary had said. She was laughing. Fully without pulling back the way she'd laughed that one time in the courtroom when he'd called her ma'am again, and it was exactly what he'd thought it would be. Worth the wait. Worth all of it. He stood and watched her laugh and felt something in him that was too large and too simple to name, so he didn't try. Edmund Pardee appeared before the federal district court in Denver 6 weeks later and settled the investigation against the trust and himself for a sum that Cross described as significant, and that resulted in the dissolution of all trust claims in Larimer County and the return of several properties that had been acquired through fraudulent pressure over the preceding 2 years. Roy Bellows, as Cross had predicted, was not protected by the man he'd been working for. He accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against Pardee, and left Larimer County in the spring, and nobody in the valley watched him go with anything other than relief. The Walker homestead did not become famous. It did not become a story that anyone told in Denver or Kansas City. It was a piece of land in a valley in Colorado that a man came home to and a woman had kept, and they worked it together through the winters and the summers, and the creek ran clear in July and trickled in September, and the cattle were healthy, and the fence lines were straight, and the garden came in good every year, because Clara knew what she was doing and did it without fuss. Ethan learned things about her slowly, the way you learn the details of a landscape you love, one feature at a time, each one adding to the whole. He learned that she read at night when she couldn't sleep, and that she had strong opinions about which books were worth the time and which weren't, and that she was reliably right. He learned that she sang sometimes in the garden, quietly old songs he half recognized from childhood, and that she stopped when she thought he could hear, so he made a habit of not letting on that he could. He learned that she cried exactly once in the second winter, on the anniversary of James's death, alone in the early morning, before she thought anyone was awake, and that she was fine by breakfast and didn't want to talk about it, and he didn't make her. He learned that she had never, not once in 14 months of being alone on this land, doubted that it was worth keeping. He thought about that sometimes. About a woman who had read a default notice in a county recorder's office and recognized a name and made a decision without knowing if the man she was making it for was alive or dead. About the particular quality of that kind of faith, not blind faith, not sentimental faith, but the working kind, the kind that shows up every morning and splits wood and clears blocked creeks and keeps records and stands on its own porch with a rifle when strangers ride up. He thought about $42 passed in a street in Cheyenne on a day he couldn't remember. He thought about what comes back to a man when he stops expecting anything to come back. He thought about his father's careful handwriting at the bottom of a land grant and a water rights declaration that nobody had looked for and that Clara had found because she'd been paying attention. He thought about riding home to say goodbye. There was a morning in the late spring of the following year when he woke early and went out to check the cattle before the sun was fully up, and he came back to find Clara standing at the kitchen window with her coffee looking at the light coming over the eastern ridge. She heard him come in, and she didn't turn around, just said, "Good morning." The way she said it every morning, not ceremonially, not as if it needed to be performed, just a true statement of the available facts. He poured himself coffee and stood beside her at the window. The light was coming up gold and slow over the Walker land, over the north fence, and the cattle pen and the garden plot, and the road that came down from the ridge and bent around the hill toward Harlow. The same road he'd ridden down 18 months ago, with nothing in his chest but ash and the intention of saying goodbye. He looked at it all. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "Tell me," she said, "how close it was." He looked at the land. How many small things had to go a certain way? The default notice being filed in that particular office on that particular day. You walking past and reading it. Hutchins being the kind of man he was. Cross being the kind of man he was. He paused. Me being alive when everybody thought I wasn't. Clara looked at the window. "You think about it as luck," she said. "Don't you?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think there's something else in it," she said. "Something besides luck." She turned and looked at him. "You helped James and me in Cheyenne without knowing who we were or what it would cost or whether we were worth it. You just did it because it was the right thing to do." She paused. "That kind of thing doesn't just disappear. It goes out into the world and it lives somewhere, and sometimes—" She looked back at the window. "Sometimes it comes home." He looked at her. He looked at this woman who had walked into his story from the outside and made it possible for there to be a next chapter, who had done it without being asked and without expectation and without ever once suggesting that he owed her more than she'd already been given. He thought about kindness given in a street on a day he couldn't remember and what it had returned to him carrying. He thought about everything he'd thought was gone. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said before he could go on. She leaned against him just slightly, the way she'd learned to lean in the months since October, comfortable and unhurried, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the window of the house his father had built and looked at the land his father had filed water rights on in 1869, and the morning came up full and wide over the Colorado mountains. This was the Walker homestead. This was the land a man had left and a woman had kept, and two people had fought for and won and come home to and built a life on one ordinary morning at a time. And every good thing in it had started with a simple act of kindness, given without the expectation of return, given freely, given honestly, given to a stranger in a street in Cheyenne on a day nobody remembered except the woman it had saved, who remembered it every day, who had carried it across half a continent and set it down in the right place at the right time and watched it grow into everything. Some kindnesses disappear for years. They travel roads you can't see and arrive at doors you haven't built yet. But they come back. They always come back. And when they do, they carry with them everything you thought the years had taken, everything you'd given up, everything you'd ridden home to grieve. They carry it back whole, and they lay it at your feet, and they say, "Here, this was always yours. You just had to wait for it to find its way home." And Ethan Walker, standing in the kitchen of the house he was born in, with his wife beside him and his land outside the window, and the Colorado morning coming up gold and unhurried around all of it, understood that completely. He had gone up a mountain looking for silver. He had come home to something worth considerably more.